Galvin Ngo, Assistant Director of Ateneo Salt Institute, interviews Dr. H. Chad Lane and Dr. Jeff Ginger about the intersection of technology, makerspaces, and learner engagement. They talk about video game behavior, entertainment, exploration, playfulness, and how these can be utilized to strengthen learner engagement in formal and informal educational settings. Dr. Lane is an associate professor of educational psychology and informatics at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. His research focuses on design, use, and impacts of intelligent technologies for informal learning. Dr. Ginger is a program director with the Illinois Informatics Institute and adjunct instructor at the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He is also the director of the Champaign-Urbana Community Fab Lab. Pocket Lectures is a show on the Arte Podcasts Network produced and recorded in Arte, Ateneo de Manila University. This episode was made possible by the Ateneo Laboratory for the Learning Sciences.
All right, so my name is Galvin Ngo. I am from the Ateneo Salt Institute, and I'm glad to host today's conversation. Today, we'll have an exciting conversation about the intersections of technology, education, makerspaces, and in particular, the emerging role that artificial intelligence and the makerspace movement is playing or is beginning to play as we look at education today. So I'd like to begin with a round of introductions. We have some special guests joining us in this conversation today. The first one is Dr. Chad Lane. Chad is an associate professor of education psychology and informatics at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. I hope I said that right.
You said it perfectly.
Chad's research focuses on the design, use, and impacts of intelligent technologies for informal learning. He has over 70 publications in a variety of areas, including intelligent tutoring, educational games, immersive technologies, and narrative-based learning environments. So, Chad, welcome to Ateneo.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Next up, we have our second guest for this podcast, Dr. Jeff Ginger. Jeff is a program coordinator with the Illinois Informatics Institute and adjunct instructor at the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's also the director of the Champaign-Urbana Fabrication Laboratory, or Fab Lab. So, welcome. Maybe we can begin with just a quick overview of about yourselves. If you can share a little bit about the kind of work that you do. We'll definitely get into the details later on. Whoever who wants to begin. Chad?
Okay, sure. I'm happy to start. So you summarized my research very well. Really, the problem that drives me, I think, is trying to build educational technologies that kids and adult learners want to use. A lot of times, those of us in the educational technology field benefit from the situation where a student is somewhat captive to their homework or getting a grade. So if we get rid of that assumption and we think about what do we need to do to actually earn this child's attention, keep them using software or some piece of technology that is designed in a way that promotes some sort of learning or engagement, or in my case, I study interest development a lot. How do we set the spark to get a child really interested in something and then set them up so they choose to re-engage with that over time? Then I feel we've really solved an important educational challenge, to overcome that I have to get my grade mentality. What we all want out of education is that, in a perfect world, all kids in educational institutions would do it because it's the right thing to do, because learning is fun. Learning is how we improve ourselves, both individually and as the human race. And so that's mighty lofty, I understand. But at the same time, we should set these big goals and design towards them and work towards them and do research towards them and see how far we can get. And so that kind of summarizes what I'm trying to do at a very high level, and we'll get into the details in a minute, like you said.
Sure. Thanks, Chad. How about you, Jeff? Anything about maybe give us an overview of the things that you're interested in, your research interests, among other things?
Yeah, so I actually wear many hats, which has been a blessing and a curse over the many years. But my PhD was actually in something called community informatics. And a lot of the emphasis there is kind of the opposite, or not opposite, a little different than what the academic world does, which is we're interested in community knowledge and what we can learn from the communities that we're in. And a lot of state institutions do this, but we really take it to heart. And starting with things like need and asset analysis. So as an example of how I like to look at the world of, you can look at things in terms of education needs. What do kids need to know? What do we need? What does the school need? But we can also look at it in a positive way of what do they offer? What's already going on that we're not paying attention to and that we can really learn from? And that's guided a lot of my development. And in fact, how I got into a lot of what we're going to be talking about in our visit is on Minecraft and learning with Minecraft. And that one raised up organically. We had an after-school program at one of the libraries where the kids were really playing Minecraft all the time. And the librarians this was this alien, what is this thing to them? And they got pretty upset with a lot of the kids. And I got to jump into the world and understand, what is it actually? Why do these kids care about it? Why does it matter? What's really going on? And it opened up a whole new world of opportunity and understanding and pictures. And so that's what I've been doing as a scholar.
Cool. So, listening to both of you, there's something that's sort of in common, and I thought that maybe we can start our conversation that way. What I can hear from both of your interests is that there's this genuine interest in sort of engagement, in getting students and learners to engage in learning, however you want to understand that. Maybe we can start with that. What for you is engagement? Do you begin to define engagement? And when you talk about the work that you do leading to student engagement or to learner engagement, how do you describe it? Chad, what do you want to say?
Sure. Yeah, it's right. I think given what I just talked about kids choosing to continue interacting with something you've developed, software, technology, if there is engagement, you usually have continued use. Continued re-engagement is sometimes the phrase you'll hear. So it is an important concept to unpack. Just to go a little academic and nerdy for a second, one of the foundational papers was written by Fredericks et al. In 2004, and it broke engagement down into three pieces. There was behavioral engagement, which has to do with the actual actions and activities of the learner. So you can look at engagement through that lens. Another one is emotional. So there's emotional engagement, which gets into caring and liking and pursuing and anything that's connected to emotions and affect. And then the third one is cognitive engagement. And we can think of that as directed thinking and problem-solving activities. So when you think about engagement through these three lenses, you can often capture most versions of it that you see in a lot of contexts, even non-learning. So my favorite example of engagement kind of in what is the real world for a lot of kids is video game play. Rage quitting is something you'll find all over YouTube. Kids get mad at a game, throw down their controller. That is really intense emotional engagement at play. They care so much for that experience for whatever reason, either beating their friends or achieving a high score. So engagement to me is something along one, two, or three of these dimensions. When we see it and we've used it properly, good things tend to happen, such as learning. Or change, behavior change is another thing that a lot of these technologies might pursue, which is basically adjusting the choices we make, whether it be dietary or, some smoking behavior, anything like that we want to change is connected to learning. But engagement tends to sit at the middle of all of that. And so my students and I all design with that goal in mind.
Jeff, anything to add?
So Chad has a great definition there. So I'm actually not going to offer a competing one, but instead add on to it. So one of the questions I often get with engagement is, all right, how are you going to measure engagement? What are the different ways you can do it? And there's lots of, based on the framework that Chad explained, there's lots of ways. But my favorite way, I'll go with that, is I like seeing the difference in inquiry of the questions students start asking at the beginning of a circumstance or the beginning of an experience and the questions they ask coming out of it. To me, that's one of my favorite ways to get at that. And another way that we'll get at this is what can be called artifact analysis or artifact interviews. So you talk to a kid about something they made, could be in a makerspace, could be in a video game, and you ask them to explain it. And their willingness and ability to explain it tells you a lot about their engagement and what it matters, with how it matters. And you can then also get very disciplinary. You can it can be its emotional engagement. You can also be like, did they engage with the subject material of like how the math works to enable them to do this or not, or were they just doing it kind of willy-nilly? My research recently has been on metacognition, and we're looking at different variables in this, but one of the ones that we've been interested in is getting kids to what I would call true iteration of, like what Chad's noting in these video games is something we just don't see a lot of in school, of persistence, right? That they'll get killed in the video game and they don't even think about it. They go right back in and jump into it again, and they'll keep doing it a million times. And like I see kids in school like have trouble with like one thing and they kind of give up forever. I want to find that fervor of video games in schooling settings. And if you add intentionality onto that, that's where I think you get true iteration, is that they're not just being persistent, but they're thinking through, what did I do that each time? How can I plan to do it differently the next time? And then iteratively grow. And kids do this organically with games, but I think we also can adapt it in makerspaces as well.
Let me add on to that a little bit. So that was a great comment, because I always compare failure in the video game world to quote failure in an academic setting. And this idea of, if I fail, I'm just going to restart and try again. I mean, we want to see that in more places than just video games, but it is part of the video game culture to restart, to spawn again. And it's no big deal. But then suddenly a struggle and quote failure in an academic setting can sometimes be the end of the story. And so anyway, working towards a more sort of growth mindset, you'll hear with Carol Dweck's work or something like that in an academic setting. Any way we can convince learners, and this gets into a little bit of behavior change, to think more like a video gamer outside of the video game world would be a game changer across the board.
So I think what's interesting about what both of you said is that what's interesting and kind of disturbing for me as an educator is that both of you, in one way or another, talked about this ideal scenario that is not present in a lot of educational institutions, right? I mean, that's the elephant in the room in this conversation. So maybe just to name the elephant in the room, what's your take on that? Why isn't this scenario that you've described over the past few minutes prevalent, emerging, very much part of what we see in schools all over the world? From your perspective, what is the inertia that you think we educators need to sort of get over to be able to get to this level of engagement for our students?
Well, I'll be brief because I know Jeff has a lot of things to say on this topic. So first, let me say, part of the reason I pursued the career that I did was from my father. He was a high school math teacher for 35 years. So I grew up in the family of a teacher. And I think my love of education came from him. And I'm very proud of what he achieved. I had people coming up to me over and over as a child saying, I don't like math, but I loved your dad's class. And how did I couldn't get him to really tell me how he achieved that outcome. That he was key to them being willing to learn math. They didn't like it. They didn't want to be there. Well, some of them, he had a variety of students, but the ones that would want to talk to me were the ones that didn't like math. And somehow he did this. It was some skill he had. And so I want to say, none of what I do has the idea of that teachers aren't central to the formal education aim. And everything I do, I also think about, what about that child who's at home working on homework or out of school? What can we do in those settings that might even have positive consequences back into the school, which then helps teachers because they don't have to they can spread their time out more. They don't have to spend half of their time on a couple of students because more of the students are self-directed and taking initiative. So I think a lot about this, but the elephant for me is a little further off in the distance in a lot of my research because I'm in summer camps, after school programs, museums, where it is a different context. But I will say the camps we run depend heavily on good facilitation. We think about how kids might use some of the stuff we develop out of that context, but a lot of us is, how do we make a summer camp an educational summer camp really effective. And the facilitation, the educators that are there, a lot of times it's us and on the research side of it, but that it is a critical component, and we see that in the data that comes out of it. So if anything, we are thinking of ways to enhance and embolden teachers to be able to go to the next level.
So I have a hopefully funny story about this. We have kids that, well, one of the schools in town, we were lucky enough to actually change some of the core curriculum. So this was Maya Israel, one of faculty at the iSchool, or not the iSchool, education, College of Education for a long time, worked with introducing Scratch into their math class. And there was some talk about whether these kids coming into the library where my lab would work, and we were trying to figure out what programming to do for these kids. And like, to have put Scratch in school was considered this major success. Kids were learning programming in K through 5, something we've never normally done. These kids got to our program and we're asking them things they might want to do. And they said, all right, well, why don't we program a game in Scratch and use Makey Makey? And kids were like, ew, Scratch, we have to do that in school. I hate Scratch. And, our hearts are broken because we know that they have the prerequisites that they want to do some of the really cool higher level learning. But because it was in school and it was forced and the kinds of things they were doing were very scripted, these kids had this negative association. And this, I think, has a lot to do with the way that we're seeing engagement work or not. And this is actually my current predicament, is that I love makerspaces and maker thinking and DIY and DIWO and all this. And I want to bring it into education, but I don't know if I actually want to put it in formalized schooling because of the way that formalized schooling often operates. So relevance and fun are big questions in it. But my most recent kind of iteration with relevance is that I'm a little wary of what I might call edutainment, of this concern that, all right, if we're going to make kids care about school, we have to turn everything into Minecraft. Well, not everything has to be a fun game. I think there are opportunities there, but really the real evolved or best version of this that I can think of is when kids know how to make something else relevant to them. They're given some source material. They look at this critically and figure out, how can I relate this to my world, my life? How can I make this interesting? And that to me is the metric, my best engagement metric. But getting there is really hard. And so we're struggling with that in a bunch of different formats of how we can make things relevant, I think.
Great. So I think Jeff transitions to our next question. And since you already started to talk about your work, I'd like to get into your work a little bit. So you've been mentioning the makerspace movement. There are lots of conversations that use the term makerspace.
Mm-hmm.
Would you mind sort of unlocking it for us? Like, from your perspective, what is a makerspace? Like, I hear a lot from a lot of educators that refer to a makerspace as an actual space,
Mm-hmm.
or as equipment, or as having equipment. But from your perspective, how would you begin to define like a makerspace movement?
Yeah, so makerspaces, in a general way, you could argue that humans have been making for as long as humans have been human, and that it might actually be an element of what makes us human. So, what is the difference now is that smash-up of kind of what I was talking about before, is that we have the ability to exchange information more easily with more people than ever before. So it's not like we've had, wood shops and sewing clubs and all that kind of stuff forever, but those people weren't necessarily going online to learn how to do this and sharing with other people on the internet. So that to me has been one of the big tipping points of the makerspace movement, is that we have more of a global community of practice. But there are a lot of ways that can look of what goes in a makerspace. And that's actually been one of the concerns about how do we implement this, that like many areas, it's been more for privileged people or more for men, or there have been populations that haven't been as welcomed into the makerspace. And so diversity, cognitive diversity, is well documented as one of the best ways to solve problems, right? But if you're going to do that, you really have to have lots of people pulled into it. So what I want is inclusive spaces, is what I'm trying to go for generally. And when I talk about a makerspace, I think I'm starting first with a space where new ideas are protected and can learn to thrive, and that there's a shared community common goal. And then we start using tools and policies to help promote that. So like one of the first mistakes I hear is people are like, oh, we're going to make a makerspace and let's get a 3D printer. It's like, all right, yes, I know they're neat, but they're nothing like Star Trek. Everybody thinks they're like, you press a button and something materializes in front of you, and they don't really know that, no, it's actually just little pieces of plastic at the low cost, and it's actually fabulously hard to do. And there are way better tools like cardboard that are more affordable that we can start with for creating our ideas physically. But it does have this resounding, there is a physical nature to it, which I love, is I don't want just a space where we create things digitally. I want to connect the two worlds. So I'll give an example of what a makerspace looks like that I really like is in Harold Washington branch in Chicago Public Library. This is downtown. It's their big library. They have a space that's called U Media. It's actually not officially a makerspace. They even have a separate makerspace at that library that is officially a makerspace. But the U Media Lab is what I would call a makerspace in every sense of it, because it has groups of kids who follow their own interests and make programs based around it. And they'll have stations like 3D printing, but also things like nail painting. So like decorative nail painting, which is something you would not find in a typical makerspace in most places. But these kids have gotten really into blinging this out of like, if you think about it, nail painting can involve lots of different elements of art, doing it at a small scale. You could put like an LED electronic controller in there. There are other parts that it could link into in the makerspace. And they welcome the student interests, the community interests in driving what kinds of making was happening there. And that is what I really want to see in makerspaces is the do it with others concept of instead of this, we need makerspaces to solve all of our engineering problems kind of view. It's more of a, what can we make and learn together? And that might coincide with let's start the greatest, biggest business ever, but it can also coincide with just doing fun hobbyist stuff. There's a lot of ground.
So maybe one last question about makerspaces. We started this conversation about the issue of engagement among students, and clearly, I think makerspaces, as you've mentioned, can be a way to sort of bring students back in, get them interested, get them to do more inquiry among other things. What can you say about maybe, let's say, people or educators who might want to, who will ask about the academics of things, who will say things like, so where's the academics in a makerspace? Like, is it worth doing? Is it just play? Are students just playing around and not really learning particular things that we hope for them to really learn? Have you gotten comments like that?
Yeah, no, this comes up very frequently because, and this was actually put to me at Fab Learn as like a straight question of, even in the extracurricular sphere, why is a makerspace better than like playing soccer or, going to do any other kind of extracurricular thing if you're even thinking it outside of school? And like you can find things like building patience and persistence in things like sports. That's absolutely valid. I think there are lots of ways to do that. But one thing that I thought of that I don't feel like I see in a lot of other spaces that makerspaces do pretty uniquely is remixing and reverse engineering. And I think these are the concepts that I complement standardized education in a lot of ways. So in a lot of standardized education, we start out with a big level of like, all right, we're going to have negative space and we're going to make a work of art based on negative space, or we're going to have object-oriented programming and we're going to learn to do a math equation as our first thing to implement that. And like the reality of how we do a lot of learning in makerspaces is, oh, that art thing's cool. I'm going to copy it, make my own version, add this other thing into it, and I'm going to have this new thing. And that's awesome. Or I'm going to download this code. I'm going to understand half of that code and I'm going to start tinkering and remixing and understand it by figuring it out from the backside. And that's realistically a lot of how people learn. And so there are a lot of ways to measure that, kind of like what I was getting at earlier with, you can have an artifact analysis interview to see how their process of learning or what questions they've asked. There are other ways we can unpack that. But I think it's actually just a different kind of approach. It's very much ground up and agency oriented. You're having choice and taking ownership over your own learning versus some authority is telling you what you need to know and you're taking a test on it. So it is countercultural in some ways. And I'm fine if some people are like, oh, that doesn't belong in the classroom. Like, all right, I'm going to make a new classroom. Like, we're going to do this cool stuff. I think it actually works really well in complement to some of the abstract and the top down. And you put the two together, you get a really powerful learning situation.
Cool. Thanks, Jeff. Sure. So you mentioned Minecraft, and I know that that's one of the things that you will be focusing on
I'll show some
in your talk. Would you mind sharing with us a bit about your project using Minecraft?
Yeah, and I think this is one of my favorite examples of where teachers have played a huge role in impacting research, and it is something I think more education researchers should do, is really pay attention to what teachers are doing. YouTube has made this a lot better because I found so many teachers that put all of their work with Minecraft out there to see. And I've seen so many videos, I could go down the list of really innovative ideas that came out of the classroom. But teachers listened to the kids and they said, hey, we love Minecraft. We want to do chemistry in Minecraft. We want to do foreign language learning in Minecraft. And enough teachers have done that. And that became, the snowball has grown large. As you know, Microsoft bought Minecraft EDU and started the education edition of Minecraft that's now in schools all over the world. And I think for me, it all started with my interest in it was with my son, and then starting to talk to other kids. And just one last thought on Minecraft. I view it as a simulation of the natural world. It really is. There's ecosystems, there's different biomes, there's different creatures to interact with. It taps into every STEM domain, and we've analyzed a lot of that. in terms of the engineering principles that come out of it, or the application of math concepts and thinking about physics. And Minecraft has its problems, right? I mean, in terms of it's not a great simulation, but it's an engaging one that's accessible, it runs on low-end computers, and kids want to use it. So in a way, it's sort of like, rather than me building something and saying, here, use it and like it, they're the ones, it started with them, impacted teachers, and it impacts the research world now. So I like that. I like that it started on the education, front lines of education side, and that brings to me a little more credibility in what we're trying to do.
You talked about using Minecraft in education, but I know that, and I found this quite interesting, that you're doing research through Minecraft or with Minecraft right now. How does that look like?
So what you find when you put a kid, a learner, in a virtual environment, it's a lot different in terms of research, because now you have access to all kinds of data. In Minecraft in particular, we track everywhere they go on a map. We track everything they do, whether it's collecting resources or building new things, interacting with each other. This is a treasure trove of information about how kids engage with science. And so we look at all of that. We give them surveys, we do interviews to, mixed methods approaches usually are the most informative for this kind of thing. But it is an amazing window into what kids like. And one of my favorite things that's come out of our work is there's two modes to play Minecraft. One is survival, which is a little more, it's some combat, it's a little more about the fighting. And then there's creative mode, which has no fighting at all. And all you do is build and create and work together. A larger percentage of our kids prefer the creative mode. They don't even want to do the fighting. And I think if can you play Call of Duty without fighting? And it's like, no, it's a critical part of that game mechanic. But Minecraft, it's not. I mean, it's certainly there, but it is most of the kids just say, hey, I love building stuff and I love being with my friends and being creative. And that's very special. And we shouldn't pass that up. So I'm trying to take advantage of what kids have said to us.
Even in the survival mode, one of the things that I think is also beneficial that I see in Minecraft and not a lot of other games is they're creating stories together. Right? Like nobody plays Call of Duty or Fortnite where it's like, the founding of their village and what their economy looks like. They're shooting each other and that's fun maybe, but so there is actually literally Minecraft story mode, but there's adventure mode too. And that for me is one of the greatest learning opportunities when you can get kids advanced enough that they've learned how to create, they've learned how to build or work collaboratively survival wise, and then they have to create a world where there's behavior-based interactions, like based on redstone or command blocks or there's very high end of things you can do with it.
I think we're kind of ripe now to answer one of the questions that we hope to begin to answer today. We've talked a lot about where technology can come in. We've talked a lot about an ideal situation in education, whether it be inside the school or maybe in a less formal scenario or in a different institution altogether. If we were to reimagine school, how would you reimagine it? I think that's a good way of sort of capping up this conversation. Like based on our conversation today and your own research and your own interests, if you were to reimagine what school looks like, what would it look like for you? Anyone can start.
I want Jeff to go first.
So I'll admit I gave this prompt earlier on because I give this to my students every year because I want them to think about how they're engaging with their education. But it does open up this bigger question of like why, and this is Ken Robinson's work. You can watch his TED Talk. So this is where this is coming from. But why did we decide to stamp students by? It's almost by manufacturing number. If they're 8 years old, they're at this grade level. They're expected this, and this. But like kids vary so much in what they know and how they work together depending on who they're with and the time of the day and the way that you're conveying what they're working on. So just our clustering and clumping doesn't make a lot of sense. But one of those things that doesn't make that much sense to me is the way that we figured out our disciplinaries, our subject matter. So, every year from like kindergarten all the way up through the end of high school, most students are taking math, science, some sort of history or humanities kind of thing. Well, history and then a humanities kind of thing, and then foreign language. Those 5 subjects every year. And when I reimagine this stuff, I want to think about where do we add in interdisciplinarity? We need to learn some basics, like we need to know arithmetic and how to read and write and that kind of stuff. But I also think we could probably teach speech at the same time we're teaching writing as intensely, in fact, and that would do us a lot of good. But anyway, let's assume we get the basics done, like K through 5. You get to junior high, up through high school, you start asking, and for those, I'm not sure, Junior high for us would translate to like 11 years old and up, just to make that clear. What are the ways that we can combine areas? So, can we take math class and turn that into computer science class, right? And those are the more mundane suggestions. Every year when I ask my students going into college about this, every time they say is, I needed a class on basically financial literacy of like, how do I deal with debt? What is a mortgage? How does this insurance thing work? None of them are ever taught those kinds of things. So there's a lot of call for, and I guess that goes even outside of interdisciplinarity. It's really just like connecting to a real world application. And really, actually, I've kind of stumbled over my words. There are two concepts here that I'm getting at: deliverables, real world applications, and interdisciplinarity. And I want to see how can we rearrange school to get at those two different things. What are the kinds of classes we could have? If we take history class and make it into contemporary news and maybe civic participation of like how to write a letter to your governing authority or get something done in your community. There are some really radical changes we can make through education, and I'd love to see a lot of that. I've asked my students for wacky ideas over the years, and they've proposed things like, what if you had a gardening class? Every year you learn how to garden. And like, that sounds a little crazy, but it would probably be society transforming. We'd probably have a lot more sustainable food culture. People would probably be arranging houses around gardens. It would just be a bigger deal in our culture because everybody learned it every year. And so I want to know what are the ways we could transform education. And I don't have a total answer. I have a lot of ideas, like some of the ones I've said, but I think there are other good ones that could be out there too.
Well, I mentioned to you the other day the kids who take the gardening class are going to be the ones who survive in the Walking Dead style apocalypse because they need that. So I love those ideas. And before I give my response, which is really compatible with the interdisciplinary idea, I think I teach a class in informal learning every year, and invariably, so we read a bunch of papers about research in out-of-school settings, and invariably, a few students get very protective of form. Why do they all hate formal school? Why do they hate school? What's so bad? And it's an interesting conversation because it's not necessarily criticisms of schools. It's schools cover certain bases. They cover certain needs. What else needs to be covered, and how can museums and after-school programs and summer camps fill in those gaps? And it's often contrasted with formal because formal gets 99% of the attention from funding agencies, from the press, and so I mean, one of the facts that blows my mind is in the United States, at least, and hopefully worldwide, there are more museums and science centers and zoos than there are McDonald's and Starbucks combined. That is a shocking fact, and no one would believe that, but it is. You can look at the numbers. There's a huge presence of informal institutions, so looking at them and what they can bring is important, and you're not tearing apart schools. But with this question, I like to think, well, why is it this way at all? And and I'm not an education historian, so if someone listening to this wants to correct me, please do. But one of the founding principles of schools has got to be that a carpenter, a baker, a banker, they were all teaching their apprentices these ideas, and they talked to each other. And I don't know if they did, but I'm saying this is part of the reason I believe schools are the way they are. Is, hey, you're teaching them math. Well, I'm teaching them math, and so are you. Well, let's just teach them math, so that then we don't have to do that. And so, in a way, the way school is organized is an optimization. And if that's the reason schools are the way they are, is a way to say, hey, we don't have to teach them math all of the time outside. We can do it in a really optimized way. What's lost in there wasn't understood, but that is then the motivation for math. And so how do we bring that motivation back in to realize this will be important to you? Trust me is not a good enough answer. And so I kind of feel like any redesign of schools, we shouldn't lose the idea of disciplinary knowledge and expertise. That is a critical thing. Specialization is, thank goodness there are people who specialize in medicine, and thank goodness there are people who specialize in engineering. But the idea of a liberal arts education where you come at these things with a richer understanding of the environment and the world is where I would go with schools, and the liberal arts model of college is on the right path. So if I were to redesign school, I would be inspired by what has happened in Luxembourg. So they have 4 national languages. How many in the Philippines?
We have
Two national languages. Luxembourg has 4. Oh, maybe it's 5. I mean, someone should correct me, but it's a large number. And what they do in their schools is you learn all of these languages starting in elementary school. So you will take, say, English for a couple of years, you'll take German for a couple of years, but they don't stop there. It's not like you have English class or German class. They actually intersect it with the disciplines. So you might learn math and English for 2 years, and then you learn math, then you keep learning math and German for 2 years, and then maybe French, after that. And so they do this beautiful weaving of language and this. So why not take that the next step? Why not then say, we're going to do English, math, and engineering together? And just do this weaving of all of these ideas to where you still have the disciplinary focus, but it's with these other flavors rolled into it. And I would envision something like that if I had more time to do it.
You want to add anything?
No, I just agree a lot with Chad. I'm also still kind of thinking fundamental in the sense that, it was great that they came together and said all these areas need math, but we're not still asking that question in the same way, right? We haven't revised the system since we came up with it a gajillion years ago. And that's kind of what I'm asking for is that let's start with Chad's premise there of what are the underlying skills that are used all over the place? Because I think that's going to arrive us at representing ideas visually. For instance, there's probably well, I don't know how many places, and yet art is such a marginalized area in terms of how it's taught in our schooling system. So I think we would come up with a very different list, even if we were going to go that direction of the sort of operational definition style. So I also wonder, you were asking earlier, all right, how do you measure this stuff? It's already really hard to measure outcomes and success. You start measuring, and that's maybe where I come back to my deliverables of what are people able to do? What are they able to make? I don't care that much about there are very few industries where it's about passing a test, is the measure of whether or not you can do your job. But there are a whole lot about creating projects and creating knowledge and applying knowledge and all that. So I think I want to come back to those deliverables as being my, portfolios being the thing versus a report card. That's kind of my direction.
Thank you. So with that big question, which we attempted to answer, I think we can wrap up our conversation here. First of all, on behalf of Ateneo, I'd like to thank Dr. Lane and Dr. Ginger for joining us today. We learned a lot from this conversation, and I really hope that people who'll be listening here, most especially the educators, would really take these things as triggers for reflection, to think about what we do in our classrooms, in our schools, and as you've been talking about, to think more about what's best for our students, not just for today, but for a future that we might not even be able to describe at the moment. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Galvin. Yes. Thanks, RJ.
We would like to thank Galvin Ngo, Dr. H. Chad Lane, and Dr. Jeff Ginger for appearing on today's episode. This was made possible by the Ateneo Laboratory for the Learning Sciences. The episode was edited by Francesco Amante with music from purple-planet.com. If you would like to listen to more pocket lectures, visit our website arte.ateneo.edu/podcasts or check us out on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Don't forget to follow @Arte Ateneo on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram for updates.